Hey Trinity, David Torrey here. Welcome to the second week of Advent. We are walking through the Gospel of Matthew and looking at the cast of characters, the different people that were involved in the story of Jesus' birth. This week we're focused on Joseph, and his story is found in Matthew 1, verses 18 through 25. So I'm going to go ahead and read those verses, and then we're going to dive into the life of Matthew a bit. It reads, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, 'Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. 'Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel.' When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to her son, and he called his name Jesus." We don't know a lot about the person of Joseph. We know that he was a carpenter, that he worked in the trades, he worked with his hands. We know that he could trace his lineage back to King David and Solomon. And we know that he found himself in an incredibly difficult predicament here in this passage. He is engaged to Mary, waiting to take her as his wife, and he finds out that she's pregnant. And so being an upright and just man, wanting to deal with the situation with integrity, he decides to divorce her quietly. As Joseph is planning to divorce Mary, it says he's considering all these things. And then God intervenes in his story. He receives a message through a dream from the angel of the Lord that the baby inside Mary's womb has been conceived by the Spirit of God. And that this baby is indeed God, and that his name is to be Jesus because he will save people from their sins. In the midst of Joseph's ordinary, everyday life, he receives this troubling news about Mary, the woman he's engaged to, that she's with a baby. And he starts to make plans on how he's going to handle the situation. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story isn't how Joseph's plans come to pass. No, it's actually that God is sovereignly at work in Joseph's life. And he has bigger and deeper plans that Joseph doesn't fully understand. And we see that Joseph and Mary begin to trust the plan that God has for their lives. The birth of Christ is it's new, it's unexpected, and it disrupts their plans that they had. But yet it's this beautiful thing that they embrace as they seek to follow God and walk in obedience. In Matthew's gospel, he uses the word fulfill 10 specific times. And he uses this word speaking of the life and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah. In this passage specifically, Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy that is found in Isaiah 7, verses 1 through 14, and specifically verses 10 through 14. In your groups, you're going to discuss this passage and this account of King Ahaz and the battle that he's going through and his opportunity to trust God in the midst of that. And so what we find happening in Matthew's gospel is Jesus is portrayed as this coming fulfillment. It's this theme that as we continue to study Matthew's gospel, we need to keep an eye out for. Where is Matthew quoting Old Testament scriptures? What stories is he referring to in the past that Jesus is bringing to complete fulfillment? Again, we see in Jesus' life that God is sovereignly working all of history to this point. All of the genealogies, all of the the life and history of Israel and God's people is leading to this moment of fulfillment in the person of Christ. There's two things we learn specifically from this passage. The first is that Jesus is conceived by the power of the Spirit. One commentator writing about Christ, he says, "The Messiah was born in flesh, not of the flesh, and therefore is able to vanquish sin and death in the region in which they had done their victories. He was not born of the flesh, but of the Spirit, and therefore he did not share in the innate proneness towards evil which all other human beings exhibit. It was possible for him to pass the whole of his life without sin." Because Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary, he's born by the power of the Spirit, he is without sin. So Jesus is our perfect sacrificial lamb, unstained by the presence of sin. The second thing that we learn is that God is with us. The name Emmanuel, that God is with us, is this profound truth that we find throughout the Scriptures. And there's 4 stages of God's presence with his people throughout the Scriptures. The first stage is in the Old Testament, where we see that God's presence goes with his people through the pillar of cloud and the fire that leads God's people through the wilderness. It's also God's presence is found on the Ark of the Covenant, between the wings of the seraphim. In the most holy place, God's presence is dwelling in the tabernacle with God's people. Secondly, we see God's presence in the person of Jesus Christ. That the most holy place, that the very real presence of God takes on flesh, comes in the person of a baby, and literally walks the dust and the dirt of earth. So Jesus has come, the presence of God has come in the flesh. The third stage of God's presence and his being with us is the current stage that we live in. Jesus no longer walks the earth, but God's presence, the Holy Spirit, lives inside each one of us. If you want to read John 14 through 17, it really describes how Jesus, he leaves and he says that his Comforter will come to us, the very presence of God, so that the age of the church is really the age of the Holy Spirit, where God's presence is indwelling believers, and that we, everywhere we go, God's presence is with us, inside of us, through the Holy Spirit. And then lastly, the fourth stage is when God will return through the person of Jesus Christ to earth one final time to judge the world, to make a new heaven and a new earth, and that God and humanity will dwell together in perfect union for all eternity. And that's the meaning of Christmas. It's the meaning of the Advent season, that God is with us, that he is with us in the person of Christ, that he came to earth, that the Holy Spirit indwells us as believers, and that we're waiting for that final day when God will make all things new, and that the presence of God, the very real physical presence of God, will dwell with humanity forever. Lastly, before we go into our discussions, we're going to listen to this song, another one by poor Bishop Hooper, about Elizabeth. Again, we're walking through the cast of Christmas, the characters that are involved in the story. So I encourage you, listen in as we hear a song from the perspective of Elizabeth as she experiences the birth of Christ.
Who is this you carry? Child, you shine like never before. Who is this, the Holy Spirit that I've never known? Spirit that I've never known. Tell me how your journey brought me such heavenly gold. Now I feel this blessed of children, and your life will be no different, only more, only more. You are the most blessed of children.